This video focuses on Lincoln's Gettysburg Address and his second inaugural address. And thinking about the two speeches, I want to give you a few points to begin with. We see in Abraham Lincoln a figure who is the ideal of that American dream. He rose from very humble beginnings and followed that pattern of rags to riches and being the status that he had as president. Perhaps not the riches of a millionaire, but he rose to great prominence. He is that self-made man that is very much a part of our American mythology, but for him, obviously, it is the true story of his life. He is a key figure, too, in the rhetorical history of the United States. He was a gifted speaker. You notice, too, he focuses on his audience. The aim is not to show off for him his abilities as a speaker and to place the emphasis on himself, but he places the emphasis on the people who are listening. He stands alongside MLK, FDR, and John F. Kennedy, too, as some of our greatest speakers. We've talked this semester, too, about various roles of literature, and I'd like to emphasize that again. We do see in literary texts, we see in texts the effort by some to create division. The texts that I tend to choose for this class are ones that tend to bring people together, but there would have been in opposition, for example, to writings by Lincoln, there would have been, there were writings in the South, literary texts that attempted to divide North from South to support the Confederacy. But we see in Lincoln the aim to create bonds between people and to bring the nation back together again. We've also talked this semester, too, about how literary texts, how art can aim to show the true depths of humanity, and it is through art too. Through art gives us the ability to understand ourselves better, and through that creative process too, essentially gets down to the core of who we are as human beings. In the Gettysburg Address, notice it's a very, very short speech. The story goes that one of the local politicians who was speaking before Lincoln at Gettysburg spoke on and on and on, an incredibly long speech. But notice how short this one is. He is at Gettysburg, November 19th, 1863, for the dedication of the cemetery there. The battle at Gettysburg was won by the North, but there were huge losses in the deaths of over 6,000 men, and thousands more were injured at Gettysburg. This is halfway through the war that is significant. So, in other words, the end is not in sight here. And that's going to be key in understanding his purpose in speaking here, too. Obviously, he's there for the dedication, but I think he has other purposes as well. He grounds the speech in the founding of the country, pointing back 80, and a score is 20 years. 87 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation. He takes the story of the country back to its founding here. He mentions, too, in both these speeches, but particularly this one, too, that the war is a test of American democracy, a test for this nation. He repeats certain words in the speech. You see words such as conceived, repeated several times. You see imagery used, too, in connection with birth. That's going to play a key role as we get to the end of the speech. The emphasis is placed on those who died, not on Lincoln. If he were placing the emphasis on himself, he would be going on and on and on and using more flowery language too. But he says in the third paragraph, but in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, because they are there to dedicate the cemetery. We cannot consecrate, that is, make this ground holy. We cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. So he emphasizes the importance of the blood spilled by those men who lost their lives there. He goes on to say, though, the world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. He places the emphasis on them. It does seem a bit ironic, though, that here it is his words that probably people do unfortunately tend to remember more than those men who lost their lives. The emphasis does tend to be placed on his words. But he shifts the focus on to the men who lost their lives. He uses repetition again, too, and words like dedication and honor to emphasize that these men, these soldiers, have sacrificed their very lives for this nation. Think about this, too. Who would have been in the audience that day? It would have been probably local people who lived in the Gettysburg area. It probably was some local politicians who might be there just to be there to have FaceTime. But also it was highly likely that there probably were some family members of individuals who had lost sons, husbands, other loved ones who had fought at Gettysburg and died there. There could have been, too, some injured soldiers who were not ready to go back to the front, who were there for the speech. So it is important that he places great emphasis on the men who lost their lives. So what's his aim here, too? Remember, this is the middle of the war. He is attempting to make the case to people out there in the audience, whether they be people who lost soldiers, lost loved ones, or perhaps others who did not. He makes the case here, too, essentially, that the war must continue, that we need to continue on with this war until the end comes and right prevails. He also wants people in the audience to remember that these men did not die in vain. If the war is not won for the Northern cause, then those men would have died in vain. He uses imagery connected with birth to emphasize the point that these men, as he says, shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and the government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. The emphasis placed then on that we need to see this through. It might be that there are more sacrifices that we need to make, but our men did not die in vain, and we need to persevere too. I guess in some ways, too, although he is there to help dedicate the cemetery, he is there, too, to kind of rally the troops again, too, and make sure that not just people who would be going to the front, but also people who were, even like the wives and the moms and the other family members, community people, would remain behind the war effort. So it's not just... It's not solely emphasizing the point that someone needs to go back to the front to fight, but also that others will continue to help support the war effort. And that might mean like putting their money toward the federal troops, housing federal troops. It could mean, too, that you send your son off, that you send your husband off. And encourage them to join the military. So this is a speech that emphasizes the importance of the bonds that people have and that the North needs to continue with the struggle. The other speech, the second inaugural address, has some of those same similarities. Now, typically in an inaugural address, a president is outlining the plan that the new president has for his administration. Here, Lincoln says, it made sense for him in his first inaugural address to lay out the plan of what he proposed to do to take the United States through the war. Here he says, though, that probably what is more important now is for him to speak about the nation coming back together again. Sometimes the speech is described as a sort of sermon because he does it. On the one hand, he emphasizes the importance of people coming back together, but he does this within a religious context. He wants to inspire people. If he does not, then the nation will fail. Now, please notice, too, the war is not officially over. The surrender at Appomattox is going to come just in about a month's time, and then Lincoln will be assassinated on April the 14th. So the context here, though, he and people in the audience would have seen the war's end in sight, but it was not officially over at this point in time. His aim here, his central aim, is in bringing people together, bringing the nation back together. The emphasis is not on him as the newly inaugurated president who's in his second term, but the emphasis is placed on the nation. So how does he do that here in the speech? He looks for commonalities between North and South. For example, he does say they both read the same Bible. He says, too, that God gives to both North and South this terrible war. He doesn't say that God gives this terrible war just to the South, but he unites the two, the North and the South, together in saying that both suffer through this war. As he concludes the speech, too, if you look at the very end of the paragraph, this is where we see that famous line, this line that is on the wall of the Lincoln Memorial. With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds. I do think here that he is speaking more to a northern audience, and most likely the people who would have been there in front of the Capitol building for the inauguration, which is the site where the inaugurations are still held, would have been in large part a northern audience. But he says, though, with malice toward none, with charity for all. I think he is using language there to aim for unifying again. We need to move beyond this. We need to bind up the nation's wounds. For the next readings, we're going to shift back over to the English side and to talk more about imperialism, but this is our last reading from American literature, and I think it's significant because we see that transitional point here. Remember, I mentioned the other day in one of my videos that here we see the transition from Romanticism, American Romanticism, with the Civil War, into realism.